Chandrakirti has said in his 6th chapter of Entering the Middle Way, verses 4 and 5, that even when ordinary persons hear about emptiness, sheer joy surges again and again within their heart. Tears of joy fill their eyes, and their hair stands up on end. Such people have the seed of perfect Buddhahood. They are the perfect vessels for this teaching. To them you should teach the sublime ultimate truth. For them the ensuing qualities will come to birth. So the principal disciple of the Heart Sutra is the disciple to whom the profound emptiness is appropriate to teach. They are ripe for it. So therefore, for such a disciple, when they hear the meaning of emptiness and having heard it, contemplate its meaning, at that time they display physical signs such as tears falling from their eyes and their hands, their hair standing up on end, essentially getting goosebumps. So that is an indication that they have the seed for Buddhahood. And therefore, it also indicates the importance of emptiness, right? Just because we can't see it with our eyes doesn't mean that it's not useful for us, right? Some might actually think that, well, emptiness is something I can't see. I can't use it in my daily life for anything productive. What's the point? Well, the Buddha has established again and again within Sutra the importance of emptiness and the importance of hearing, contemplating, and meditating upon it. So emptiness is said to be a middle way. So it's a middle between two extremes. And there are said to be objects that are middle ways and consciousnesses that are middle ways, sometimes referred to object and subject middle way. So the object middle way here is the emptiness that is taught within the Perfection of Wisdom sutras like the Heart Sutra. It is an object middle way because it is devoid of, it is an absence of the object of negation. The subject middle way or the consciousness middle way is that wisdom that realizes this emptiness. Now, this could be a wisdom arisen from listening, arisen from contemplation, or arisen from meditation. It could be conceptual, or it could be a direct realization of that object middle way emptiness. The middle way view was investigated by masters within India and likewise by masters within Tibet. And this middle way of not existing and not existing is a difficult one to exactly touch upon. And therefore, some masters erred in their conclusions and ended up with views called other emptiness rather than self-emptiness. And this is because they went wrong with their identification of the object of negation. And therefore, they ended up with this other emptiness view that actually became prominent within Tibet. So we need to understand that emptiness is a middle way between the two extremes of, what is it? This one I've forgotten. Of superimposition and denigration or negating too much, right? Between the two extremes of annihilation and permanence. So those proponents of this other emptiness theory are principally the Jonangpas in the Tibetan tradition. They, of course, still exist. And their analysis of emptiness was not brief, but rather extensive. And they, from their side, analyzed the intentions of the Perfection of Wisdom sutras and so on and so forth, and came to a conclusion of emptiness in which, for example, if we are to give a very rough examination of their position, would be that a flower is empty of other in the sense of it's empty of being a mug, for example. Now, this is a very like rough, almost a straw man position of their understanding of other emptiness. Of course, it goes much more profound and deeper than that, but one could roughly say that that's what they assert. We, however, do not assert other emptiness within the victorious tradition of Tsongkhapa, right? We assert self-emptiness. So one might think, well, what does it mean for a flower to be self-empty? Does it mean a flower is empty of being a flower? Well, that's not actually our position, and that's not what self-emptiness means. Something like a flower is self-empty because it is dependently arisen, right? It's independently arisen, therefore it's established independence upon its parts, and therefore it is empty of self. So therefore, self-emptiness is an emptiness of being established from one's own side. And having understood that, then one might think, well, if I'm not established from my own side, do I no longer exist? And fall into a way of thinking that accords with annihilation. I being self-empty means it's empty of of a self that is the object of negation, right? The I exists. It exists conventionally. It is a dependent origination. It is an imputation. It exists by mere name. And therefore, it does not exist from its own side. So it's empty of existing from its own side, and therefore self-empty. So that's the view. And you can posit the view in terms of object and subject, right? As described before with the middle way. So here, the object view is the five aggregates being empty of established from their own side, right? As we're discussing in the Heart Sutra. The view that pertains to the subject, right, which is a consciousness realizing the view. As for whether we have attained that, I would say it's difficult to say we have. As for me, I have not. As for you, I don't know. I don't know which realizations you have. So to have a view of the subject, which is a realization of emptiness, means that you either realize it by way of a meaning generality, so conceptually, or you realize it directly, right? It has to be one of those two. So in order to even start contemplating this so-called middle way view, this view of emptiness, we need to identify the object of negation. And as Shantideva said in his Bodhisattva's Way of Life, without touching upon the imputed thing, you cannot apprehend its non-existence. So therefore, we have to touch upon the object of negation and think, if something were to exist from its own side, how would it exist? Otherwise, if we don't understand it in that way, we might be under the assumption that when we're talking about emptiness, it simply refers to like an empty house that is not full of furniture, right? An empty room. And that's not what we're talking about here at all. All phenomena are unreal, right? They're false. All phenomena are false. They're false in the sense that their mode of existence and mode of appearance are incompatible. So to us, everything appears as truly existent, right? The flower in front of me appears to us to be truly existent. In reality, it is not truly existent at all. In reality, it does not exist from its own side. It is a mere imputation. It is a mere designation. It exists by mere name alone. However, because how things exist and how things appear don't accord for us, we end up mistaken in our approach to the world. In the sutras, there are many famous examples given in order to facilitate our understanding of emptiness, to illustrate that the way things appear are not the way that they exist. Such examples are that of a mirage, that of a reflection, and so on and so forth. So, for example, if we look in the mirror, we see a reflection of our face. So that is the appearance. In reality, its mode of existence is that it is not our face. Another famous example is the reflection of the moon within the water. So when a moon reflects onto water, what we see is an appearance of the moon. In reality, it's not the actual moon there in the water. So that again illustrates that things appear as truly established, truly existent, but in reality, they are not truly established at all. Without a realization of emptiness, it's impossible to say that one could attain the victorious state of omniscience, right? Without a realization of emptiness, one cannot abandon the beginningless conception of true existence together with its seeds. Okay. Sorry, I had written down another quotation from Aryadeva's 400 verses that I thought Geshe was going to read, but he's reading another one. So Aryadeva in his 400 verses says, seeing the selflessness in the object, one negates the seeds of existence. So this is the principal topic of the Heart Sutra. It is emptiness. And implicitly, it's teaching the paths that realize emptiness. So the path of accumulation, realizing emptiness, the path of preparation, realizing emptiness, up to the path of meditation, realizing emptiness. So the intended disciple of the Heart Sutra receives this teaching wherein Shariputra asks Avalokiteshvara essentially a question on how disciples of this particular text, the Heart Sutra, having aspired towards full enlightenment, should train in the paths realizing emptiness. And he starts by Shariputra starts his inquiry by saying to Avalokiteshvara, how should sons of noble family or daughters of noble family train if they wish to engage in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom? And then Avalokiteshvara replies in this manner by indicating implicitly the way such a disciple trains on the path of accumulation, preparations, path of seeing, path of meditation, all the way up to Buddhahood. So this series of question and answers between Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara is the teachings of the Buddha that are assented to or permitted by the Buddha, right? Because we have to prove or establish that this sutra is the word of the Buddha, right? It wasn't the words that came from his mouth. Nonetheless, it is the word of the Buddha. And this point is debated a lot. So when establishing whether it is actually the speech of the Buddha, one concludes that it is the speech of the Buddha because it was inspired by the blessings of the Buddha. And then there are other points of debate as to whether what was written down, right, and translated into languages like English is actually the word of the Buddha. So the Heart Sutra that we recite was not inspired by the blessings of the Buddha. That is not what produces our speech. What produces our recitation of the Heart Sutra is a very coarse motivation for doing so. And therefore, our recitations of Chinese and English or whatever Heart Sutra version you recite is up for question as to whether it is the speech of the Buddha, because does it actually teach emptiness in a way that is understandable to the intended disciple of the Heart Sutra? So these are some things that we debate about with respect to the Heart Sutra, and likewise, what does it mean to be the speech of the Buddha? So with respect to how Avalokiteshvara answered Shariputra's question about progressing along the path and realizing emptiness, he starts by indicating the manner in which a disciple trains on the path of accumulation. And towards the beginning of the sutra, he says, they should correctly observe the 5 aggregates to be empty of intrinsic nature. So this is indicating how to train on the path of accumulation. So one listens to the meaning of emptiness and here it's applied to the basis of the five aggregates. One contemplates that through reasoning and eventually transforms that wisdom arisen from contemplation into a wisdom arisen from meditation. So here in the Heart Sutra, emptiness is applied to the basis of the five aggregates. So one might wonder, why not apply it to the basis of a flower or any other object? Why to the five aggregates? Well, the intention behind that is probably that the five aggregates are something that are always with us. We've possessed them throughout limitless lifetimes. Therefore, we are familiar with them. And therefore, it's probably easier to identify their emptiness. So we're still in the same place in the Heart Sutra with respect to the path of accumulation. So taking that wisdom arisen from hearing and contemplation that applies to the path of accumulation, one develops that into the wisdom arisen from meditation. And when one achieves that, one is on the path of preparation. So then moving through the text, Avalokiteshvara explains to Shariputra how one should practice the perfection of wisdom on the path of seeing and meditation. So essentially, taking that wisdom arisen from meditation on the path of preparation, which is a realization of emptiness through a meaning generality. One meditates on that continuum until that meaning generality fades away, it becomes more subtle, and eventually the realization turns into a clear appearance of emptiness. And when that meaning generality has completely fallen away, one has achieved the path of seeing, right? A direct realization of emptiness. And here we see that Avalokiteshvara explains the way to train in the path of seeing with that direct realization by indicating that what that path of seeing is actually engaging in are these eight profundities, right? They are the objects of the eight forbearances and eight knowledges that correspond to the uninterrupted path and the liberated path of the path of seeing. So that path of seeing eliminates or abandons its portion of abandonments, which are the intellectually acquired or artificially created apprehensions. And then one cultivates that further and moves on to the path of meditation, in which one tackles the innate conceptions. So where we're up to in the Heart Sutra is where Avalokiteshvara explains the way the disciple trains in the perfection of wisdom while on the path of meditation. So that corresponds to this passage in the text. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, feeling, no perception, no formation, no consciousness, and so forth. So starting with the five aggregates again. So at this point, the disciple is being taught how to accumulate the collections of pristine wisdom, realizing emptiness on the path of meditation with respect to these 51 bases of emptiness, the five aggregates, and so forth. So how should we apply these words? What does it mean in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, within the context of the path of meditation? Well, here the commentators largely agree that how it should be interpreted is that to the pristine wisdom directly realizing emptiness on the path of meditation, there is no appearance of form, feeling, perception, and so forth, right? It does not appear. There are no appearances of conventional existence to such a pristine wisdom. Of course, one can still apply the understanding here, the very general understanding that when it says in emptiness there is no form, it means that form is not established by way of its own side, feeling is not established by way of its own side, and so on and so forth. So what is this form here that it's even talking about? Well, it's the form that is the form aggregate within the five aggregates. So that is the form that we are identifying as not being truly existent from its own side, not being established from its own side. Not some external form to us, but a form that is included within our own continuum as a person, right? That we have experience of, right? The form that if it is injected with a substance by a needle, it hurts, right? We have a conscious connection to the form it's talking about here, right? That's what this form aggregate is. So that form aggregate does not exist from its own side, does not exist inherently. And likewise, the feeling aggregate too, which are the feelings of happiness, suffering, and neutral feelings, they do not exist from their own side or inherently. They exist conventionally. They exist conventionally because they are dependent arisings, and they are not truly existent because they are dependent arisings. So now we need to identify what the other aggregates are. So it says no perception, but what is this perception that doesn't exist from its own side or exist inherently? So this aggregate of perception is the consciousness that we have that identifies things as, for example, being a mug. So it's that thought, this is a mug, this is a tree, this is a flower, right? It's that which discriminates, and that's why it's sometimes called the aggregate of discrimination. So it too does not exist by way of its own side. It is empty of the object of negation, which is true existence. And then we move on to there being no formations. So this aggregate of formations is essentially the phenomena within our continuum that are not form, feeling, or consciousness. So basically everything else. So that comes down to our consciousnesses of recollection. It comes down to mental factors such as anger and so forth. It is the factors of impermanence and being compounded that exist within our continuum. It's those other factors, right, that are none of those other aggregates. And then we have no consciousness. So here, with respect to the aggregate of consciousness, it refers to that aggregate of consciousness that doesn't cease, that continues from lifetime to lifetime. And it too does not exist by way of its own character. La seconda. So after Avalokiteshvara expressing the lack of inherent existence of the five aggregates, he then expresses that there is no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. So these are the five powers of the eye and so forth. So here the eye sense power is not a consciousness, it is the empowering condition to produce an eye consciousness. So it's an internal form that empowers the eye consciousness, right? It's one of its main conditions. Here, no mind refers to the mind. Oh boy, you can't say this one. Then Avalokiteshvara continues saying there is no form, no sound, no smell, no taste, no texture, and no mental object. So these are the forms and so forth that are external to our own continuum or external to our experience. So everything you see outside. So they too are mere imputations. They exist by mere name. They don't exist inherently. And the same objective negation is likewise being negated with respect to those. Avalokiteshvara continues by saying there is no element of the eye up to no element of the mind, and further up to no element of the mind consciousness. So these are the six elements that are upon which the primary consciousnesses depend to come into existence, and they too are dependently arisen and do not exist from their own side. Next in the list come the 12 factors or the 12 links of dependent origination. So there is no ignorance and no exhaustion of ignorance up to no aging and death and no exhaustion of aging and death. So essentially, what Avalokiteshvara is indicating is that an uninterrupted path of the path of meditation is realizing the emptiness with respect to the five aggregates, the five sense powers, the six consciousnesses, their constituents, their elements, and likewise the emptiness with respect to the 12 links of dependent origination, and so on, in order to accumulate the collections of pristine wisdom. So it realizes their lack of being established by way of their own side by even a single atom's worth, and understands that they are conventionally existent. So we understand that they are conventionally existent, meaning that they are mere imputations, exist by mere name alone, and therefore they cannot logically exist from their own side. There is no ignorance and no exhaustion of ignorance, up to no aging and death, and no exhaustion of aging and death. So here it's teaching the 12 links of dependent origination that are the thoroughly afflicted class, and the 12 links of dependent origination that are of the thoroughly purified class. It talks of the manner of their arising and also the manner of their reversal, and again indicates that there is no inherently established ignorance and no inherently established exhaustion of ignorance. Conventionally, there is an abandonment of the first link of beginningless ignorance, and then the abandonment of the formations and the consciousnesses and so forth in those 12 links. But there is no abandonment of inherently existing beginningless ignorant, no abandonment of inherently existing first, second, third, or fourth links, right? And thus it is teaching the non-inherent existence of the forward order and the reverse order of the 12 links of dependent origination.
다단다 매 소야 강데 아니 직 가자 랑원을 투비다 오 매바.
So this negation throughout the text of saying that there is no this, no that, should be understood to be negating the correct object of negation, which is establishment from its own side, right? So all of these no words here, no element of the I, no ignorance, and so forth, mean that there is not that existing inherently, right? Otherwise, one might think, what's the point of saying that these don't exist, because they do exist conventionally? Well, it is the profound instructional advice that, the profound advice that they do not exist inherently. And without identifying that point, that is where we go astray, right? Without identifying the object of negation, we end up grasping at true existence. And through grasping at true existence, we accumulate karma. And through accumulating karma, it results in suffering and so forth. So therefore, it's a very important point here to understand what it means when the Heart Sutra says there is no this or no that. Then it continues, there is no suffering, no origin of suffering, no cessation of suffering, no path, no wisdom, no attainment, no non-attainment. So just like the five aggregates and so forth that we have discussed do not appear from the perspective of a pristine wisdom directly realizing emptiness on the path of meditation, these factors too, these Four Noble Truths, do not appear to such a consciousness that directly realizes wisdom. However, despite those things not existing from their own side in reality, they do exist conventionally. There's no need for me to give an in-depth presentation of the Four Noble Truths here, because we've already covered that in our Lamrim classes. But here, where it says there is no suffering, it of course refers to the three types of suffering, the suffering of change, and all-pervasive suffering. So although we do suffer and we have all three types of suffering, this suffering does not happen from its own side. It's not a truly established suffering, and it only exists conventionally as a mere designation, a mere imputation. And likewise for the rest of the Four Noble Truths, here when it says there is no origin of suffering, for example, the karma that produces that suffering, the karma we accumulate by which we are reborn into samsara, that too only exists conventionally. It does not exist by way of its own side. We do not accumulate karma from its own side and are not born into cyclic existence from its own side. All of this exists merely conventionally. And likewise, you can apply that to the other noble truths that follow, where it says there's no cessation of suffering and no path. So then it says there is no wisdom or no pristine wisdom. So in this context, this refers to the pristine wisdom that directly realizes emptiness on the path of meditation, that is the uninterrupted path. So that too does not exist from its own side and only exists conventionally. So here, Avalokiteshvara is answering Shariputra by telling him the way such a disciple trains on the path of meditation. So he has indicated the way in which, or the objects which the path of meditation is actually realizing. So it's realizing the emptinesses on the bases of these 51 objects, right? The 5 aggregates and so forth. So that is the practice of the path of meditation. Within the presentation of the path of meditation, there are, of course, the presentation of the 10 grounds. Also keep in mind that when we say that the path of meditation realizes the emptiness of these 51 bases, these 51, which are the 5 aggregates, the 18 constituents, the 12 links of dependent origination, Four Noble Truths, and so forth, include all phenomena that exist. Right? There's not a single phenomena that isn't included within one of those. So please have some water. So of course, although I say let's meditate on emptiness, we understand now that it's very difficult to just slip into a meditation of emptiness in which we understand exactly what we're supposed to be meditating on and have a clear idea of the object, right? This is hard. So let's take a step back and approach it in this way. So in this life, we experience a lot of suffering, right? All 3 types of suffering, the suffering of suffering, suffering of change, all pervasive suffering, right? We have these feelings of suffering as well. Their origin is karma and affliction. Karma and afflictions. And here, what affliction we're principally identifying as their root is beginningless ignorance, which is an apprehension of true existence. So due to an apprehension of true existence, we cannot easily identify the object of emptiness, right? And due to not understanding and identifying emptiness, we end up accumulating karma by which we suffer. So it's very important for us to understand that what the apprehension of true existence is actually grasping at does not exist. And that absence of the grasped object of the apprehension of true existence is emptiness, right? So therefore, when we think about emptiness, we need to think that when you actually look at an object and search for the designated object, you do not find it. And not finding it is emptiness. And that's what we're going to meditate on now. Don't want to meditate too long because we might fall asleep. So we've covered the meaning of there being no wisdom, as Avalokiteshvara says. Then he says there is no attainment. So in some commentaries, it says that the attainments here refer to the qualities attained on the Buddha ground. So the 10 powers, the 4 fearlessnesses, and so on and so forth. That they are not attained from their own side. One does not attain a truly existent quality of a Buddha, likewise. However, conventionally, they are attained, right? That is the point of performing these practices and meditating on these emptinesses which is in order to attain them.
마토바이
And
메타스
then,
인들다.
and then it says, and no non-attainment. So some commentaries have treated this to mean that there is no inherently established thing that is attained, yet there is something attained conventionally. So thus finishes the explanation of how to train in the perfection of wisdom on the path of meditation. So the path of meditation includes 9 uninterrupted paths and 9 liberated paths that span the 10 grounds, right? There are these so-called 9 rounds on the path of meditation, and that's what it's referring to. So by way of these 9 rounds of consciousnesses, it deals with 9 rounds of portions of abandonments that are abandoned sequentially. And these paths of meditation are all a continuum of a single consciousness. I think Geshe was trying to say. Maybe I should clarify it because I don't want to say the wrong thing. Gonda Geshe gi golom din sutsangwa ani sheba jigres sedo gaso ani gyun jigres segurbe kande segure.
네, 다 골람 가서 아니 골람 요목걸 고요한즈나 아니 셰바로 왔다 셰바가 사탕고 니바 숨바가 균균치네 목에 빵자를 빵 두고 그래서
Mm.
목에
So
빵자를
so these parts of meditation, right, these 9 rounds are all a continuum of a single consciousness. So they all realize the same object that is emptiness. However, they are abandoning different portions of objects of abandonment because the continuum becomes more and more powerful and is able to deal with more and more subtle objects of abandonments that are innate conceptions of true existence. So once you get to the 10th ground, right, which is still the path of meditation, its objects of abandonment are divided into 2, subtle and coarse, right? They're the final objects of abandonment. And the uninterrupted path that deals with those subtle portions of objects of abandonment, the final portion, is called the Vajra-like meditative stabilization. So here, what follows in the Heart Sutra is actually an explanation of the Vajra-like meditative stabilization of the path of meditation. So what it does is act as a direct antidote to cognitive obscurations. And it too is an equipoise on emptiness. And once it has abandoned those subtle cognitive obscurations, in its second moment, one achieves the liberated path included on the ground of a Buddha. So essentially, one is a Buddha in the second moment after the Vajra-like meditated stabilization has abandoned that final portion of cognitive obscurations.
다 골람 도시 대비 띵인진서 타마들라 콜로 도시에서 민타와 가서나 아니 지 템보 요함며 봐.
So why is it called Vajra-like? That is because it is particularly stable and unwavering, right? So this final meditation, unlike the uninterrupted paths of the first, second, third ground, and so forth, lead to Buddhahood in that particular session. So those preceding uninterrupted paths actually end in what is called subsequent attainment. So one comes out of meditation after those other preceding uninterrupted paths, one sees conventional phenomena again, might accumulate some merit, and so on and so forth. But here, when one enters into equipoise in this Vajra-like meditative stabilization, one continues with it until one achieves Buddhahood in the very same session. So another reason it is called Vajra-like is because it is classically compared to the god Shakra's Vajra weapon that he holds in his hand, which is said to be endowed with all sorts of qualities of power and stability and so forth. And Geshe said there are actually many stories one could tell about a Vajra, but I won't go into them now. So with respect to this Vajra-like meditative stabilization, Avalokiteshvara continues. He says, Shariputra, therefore, since bodhisattvas have no attainment, they rely upon and dwell in the perfection of wisdom. So what does he mean here by bodhisattvas having no attainment? Well, he means that there is no inherent attainment of Buddhahood through entering into equipoise on this Vajra-like meditative stabilization, which abandons the subtle cognitive obscurations, right? So the attainment here is the attainment of Buddhahood, having abandoned those final subtle cognitive obscurations. And although it does not exist inherently, that attainment is tenable conventionally. Conventionally, it does exist. They rely upon and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, again, refers to this Vajra-like meditative stabilization. They rely upon it and they dwell within it. They are in equipoise within it. And I will continue this point in the next class because we're out of time. So actually, there are many different commentaries on the Heart Sutra that elucidate these passages quite differently. But it's not a big deal that there are some disagreements as to some superficial points, right? Fundamentally, the emptiness that they all explain is the same, and that's the important thing, right? Whether it be these seven authoritative Indian commentaries or the many, many Tibetan commentaries. Of course, there are going to be different explanations of the literal words, and there's going to be disagreement and refutation among the commentaries, but fundamentally they agree on the meaning of emptiness, which is the most important.
Okay, Sheila. Can you explain form is not other than emptiness. Emptiness is not other than form.
Okay. So going back to near the beginning of the Heart Sutra, the sentence that says emptiness is not other than form and form is not other than emptiness. So Geshe said, how about we start with the two preceding phrases to that because it helps clarify it. So prior to that, it says form is empty, emptiness is form. And actually, in a lot of manuscripts, it says form is emptiness, which the Tibetans have translated as empty. So, of course, this is also hard for me to explain, but I'll try to explain it as well as I can based on the explanations I have heard. So, starting with form is empty, it doesn't mean that form is emptiness. For example, it doesn't mean this flower itself is emptiness. It means form or this flower is empty of existing from its inside. It is self-empty, and the word self in self-empty means establishment from its own side, right? So from its mere establishment, it was empty. So that's clear. That's form is empty. Emptiness is form. So this doesn't literally mean that emptiness itself is form. What it means that is that from within form being empty, it still conventionally exists, right? Conventionally, it still functions. It is logically tenable to posit its existence from within being empty. So that's why it says emptiness is form. So then we get to emptiness is not other than form, right? So form, or more directly, the example we can use is the flower in front of me, does not exist separately from its emptiness, right? The emptiness of a flower, or the flower's lack of existing from its own side, exists with the flower. They are one entity and different isolates. Form is also not other than emptiness, is also getting at the same point. So form does not exist separately from its own emptiness. The emptiness of form does not exist separately from form. So using the example of a flower, the flower here would be the conventional truth and its emptiness, the ultimate truth. The point it's getting at is that they do not exist as separate entities. They are one entity, different isolates. So to recap, form as emptiness or form as empty does not mean that form itself is the ultimate truth, emptiness. Rather, it's simply indicating that form is empty of existing from its own side. And then emptiness as form does not mean that this mug in front of me or the flower is, that emptiness is those things. It doesn't mean that emptiness is the mug or emptiness is the flower. Rather, what this indicates is that from within the flower not existing from its own side, it still conventionally exists. So what this shows us is, or what this does, is eliminate the extreme of annihilation, wherein you might think that because the flower is empty, it doesn't exist. So instead of one coming to that conclusion, one instead understands that although the flower does not exist from its own side, it still exists conventionally, and therefore one does not fall into the extreme of annihilation. So to apply this all to the analysis of oneself, the I, for example, is imputed onto the five aggregates, right? This I, me, is an imputation onto the five aggregates. Yet when I look for it, when I look for the I don't find it, right? I look for it among my body and among my other aggregates. I don't find the I. But that doesn't mean the I doesn't exist. It's not found, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So what it means that is that from within the I being empty of existing from its own side, it still conventionally exists. There is still an I that goes, an I that eats, an I that drinks, an I that sleeps, right? One cannot deny that. And that I exists from within being empty, from within not existing by way of its own character, and so forth.